Taylor will now talk to us about China's military capabilities and doctrine.
Great. Just wanted to start off by extending my thanks to MBR and the Wilson Center. This is an absolutely terrific program, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I think, especially within the Academy, we need more and more policy-relevant research, and I'm going to make a small plug at the end for the Security Studies program at MIT to fulfill some of the goals that Dan outlined, because I agree with him completely. When the organizers asked me to participate on this panel, they wanted me to talk about not only Chinese military capabilities, but also Chinese doctrine, and to be provocative in 10 minutes, which is a bit of a tall order. I think I must have woken up on the contrarian side of the bed when I got around to putting my remarks together, because what I've decided to do is really talk about 5 or 6 conventional wisdoms that I think have emerged in sort of the policy discourse about China's growing military capabilities, and offer some comments and reflections on them. And typically, the way one might try to be provocative about thinking about the PLA would be to say, oh, on the one hand, they're really not as strong or as capable as we think. They have got all these problems. Or on the other hand, saying, historically, we've always underestimated their capabilities. They're much stronger than we think, and thus the threat is more pressing. And PLA modernization is, in fact, so complex and complicated that one could actually find data to make both arguments pretty persuasively and compellingly. That's not what I'm going to try to do here today. Instead, I'm going to talk a bit about what I see are these emerging conventional wisdoms and some thoughts about them. The first is that, sort of at the end of the day, what China really wants, its ultimate aspiration, is regional hegemony, and not just regional hegemony for its own sake, but to displace the United States as the dominant power in Asia. This is a framework that has the virtue of both being sort of straightforward and clear, and allows one to organize what the PLA is doing quite neatly. Yet it may be too simple, and it may obscure much more than it reveals. I suppose this does reflect my training in Chinese politics, but my own view is that the drivers of China's modernization effort are much more complicated and much more multifaceted than just hegemony. This, of course, begs the question, why does China want a strong military? I contend that there are 6 reasons in rough order of priority from Beijing's perspective. The first 3 are now what China is calling, mostly and publicly and somewhat still and privately, its core interests. The first and foremost is regime security. China wants a strong military to keep the CCP in power. We tend to forget that the PLA is a party army. It's not a national army. And whenever one reads a leadership speech in China about the role of the PLA, it always starts with the absolute, or supporting or maintaining the absolute leadership of the party within China. The second is territorial integrity, and this refers mostly today to the outstanding territorial disputes that China has with many of its neighbors. And the third, of course, is national unification, which is simply another way of talking about Taiwan. Although Taiwan is a territorial dispute in sort of the literal sense of the word, it is quite a distinctive territorial dispute. And I don't think in this room one needs to go through the Taiwan conflict. The next 3 goals are certainly very important for Beijing, but they haven't yet defined them as core interests. That would be, the fourth would be external stability, maintaining an environment that's conducive to economic growth, not just in China's immediate periphery, as has been the case, I think, for most of the 1990s and part of this decade, but also in areas in other regions, such as Africa, where it has important economic interests. And in one of the breakout sessions earlier today, Eli Ratner talked a lot about how stability in these more far-flung regions might pose a problem for Beijing, or instability. The fifth is maritime rights and interests. This has actually been an important goal for China since the mid-1980s and Admiral Liu Huaqing's sort of efforts to advocate for the PLA Navy, but it's gotten a lot more attention in recent years, and especially since roughly 2006, focusing mostly on ensuring access to resources, but also the security of sea lanes. And then I think a 6th goal has generally emerged, which I would describe perhaps as global presence. China, one value of having military forces that you can send to other regions is simply to symbolically show that you care about what happens in those other regions and you'd like to be a part of the solution. It's not necessarily about projecting combat power against some other nation state in a far-flung region, but I think China wants to ensure that its interests are taken into account, and those interests have certainly grown. If China doesn't seek hegemony, does this mean that we won't have major conflicts of interest? Of course not. I think Dan has laid out what those conflicts of interest are quite nicely and succinctly. But I do think framing China's sort of objectives in terms of these goals is important for several reasons. Firstly, I think understanding these different intentions helps ensure that the right policy prescriptions are made, because we want to know specifically what Beijing wants and how it's crafting its military capabilities to achieve these goals. Hegemony, I think, as Mike Lampton alluded to yesterday, if it's framed in terms of hegemony, it tends to become a zero-sum conflict, and any gain that China makes will certainly come at the expense of the dominant power. Secondly, I think it demonstrates that PLA modernization is a broad-based effort, not just focused on the United States. I think in Washington, it's certainly common to focus on those aspects of PLA modernization that do potentially impact the United States, but it's a much broader effort than that. And finally, this range of goals suggests that the PLA actually has to make a lot of trade-offs in where it's going to allocate its resources and how it's going to achieve these different goals. The second conventional wisdom that I think has emerged perhaps more recently is that China somehow enjoys a favorable geographic position because it sits in the center of the Asian continent and thus can project power in all sorts of different regions, all sorts of different directions. And this, I think, was most clearly and compellingly articulated by Robert Kaplan in a recent article in Foreign Affairs entitled The Geography of Chinese Power. Moreover, Kaplan described China's pivot position as a blessing. I would submit, however, that the opposite is true. China's geographic position is a curse, not a blessing. Geography constrains the projection of power. It does not facilitate it. Consider the following attributes of China's regional security environment. It possesses 14 neighbors just on its land border, along with 8 at sea, and it has 6 territorial disputes with many of these neighbors, as well as past histories of conflict. That's just a daunting set of bilateral relationships to manage on a day-to-day basis. The United States, by contrast, has 2 neighbors, and one can see why Chinese leaders do not necessarily enjoy their position in the center of the Asian continent. Secondly, there are 4 states with nuclear weapons: Russia, India, Pakistan, and North Korea in the region. Several more states that could produce nuclear weapons if they wanted to: Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Fourthly, there are several potential failed or failing states: North Korea, Pakistan, Afghanistan, other Central Asian republics that could potentially pose security challenges for Beijing in different parts of its periphery. Several states with large and sophisticated ground forces, as was talked a little bit about yesterday: India, Russia, and the 2 Koreas. And finally, 2 of the best navies and air forces in the world, with the United States and Japan. This is not an enviable or blessed geographic position. And I think it has 3 important implications for how we think about China's military capabilities and doctrine. Even if hegemony were China's goal, and here hegemony is defined as being the dominant power that can impose its will on others and defeat any other major power in a fight over the interests that it chooses, it would be very hard to achieve. There are simply too many countervailing forces pushing against China from the north, from the south, from the east, from the west, maritime challenges, continental challenges, and so forth. So even if hegemony is the goal, it is hard to see how China would be able to break out of all the potential balances that can be formed against it. Secondly, this geographic position greatly complicates Chinese force planning. Of course, for the PLA, the main strategic direction remains Taiwan and a potential conflict both with Taiwan and the United States. But as recently as last August, when Defense Minister and member of the Central Military Commission, Liang Guanglia, was touring the Lanzhou and the Chengdu military regions, he also emphasized how sort of the northwest and the southwest were also important strategic directions for the PLA. And again, this gets to questions as to how the PLA chooses to allocate its resources. Finally, the geographic complexities surrounding China suggest that projecting combat power is actually quite hard to do because different geographies, different terrains require different platforms and capabilities. There isn't just one system that the PLA can acquire, or one set of systems that it can acquire to project power. The third conventional wisdom, which has been around for a long time, is that defense spending is somehow a good measure of capabilities, especially when calculated in terms of purchasing power parity. 3 quick points here. No 2 countries account for defense spending in the same ways, and so it's a very bad measure of all of the funds that a state devotes to defense. This doesn't just include China, but includes most countries in the world. For technical reasons that I won't go into during my remarks, I think the purchasing power method is just misleading at best because it was primarily devised to account for differences in the cost of living, not differences in how technology is produced or how weapons systems are produced. The fourth conventional wisdom that I want to talk a little bit more about is that since sort of 2004 and Hu Jintao's articulation of the new historic mission for the PLA and an increasing emphasis in what Chinese sources refer to non-war military operations, which is similar to but not exactly what the U.S. describes as mutuwa, that this really reflects a desire to extend influence overseas. And certainly, on the one hand, it is a desire to extend influence overseas. We just have to look at the anti-piracy patrols that have been conducted, or in which Beijing has participated since December 2008. And two of the four historic missions that Hu Jintao did assign to the PLA are to provide support for safeguarding China's expanding national interest and to play a role in safeguarding world peace. At the same time, what I think is missed in some of this discussion is how internally focused the other half of these new historic missions were and how internally focused most of the non-war military operations are. As my friend and colleague at the Center for Naval Analysis, David Finkelstein, once wrote about 10 years ago, Chinese leaders wake up every day thinking about internal political stability. I would submit that the same is true today, and this has an impact on how we should think about their military capabilities. Consider the following: mass incidents in China, roughly 8,000 in 1993, and today, or as of 2009, somewhere between 90,000 and 120,000. Ethnic unrest, Xinjiang in the summer of 2009, and Tibetan areas in 2008. And ethnic unrest for Chinese leaders is perhaps even more worrisome than it would be under normal circumstances because these groups reside near international frontiers. And finally, natural disasters and pandemics. Not only SARS, but the Wenchuan earthquake in Sichuan in 2008, I think, killed somewhere between 70 and 90,000 people. China doesn't have a federal emergency management administration. It has the People's Liberation Army to deal with these events. Thus, when we look at the content of the doctrine that has been produced on non-war military operations, and recently I had the pleasure of going through 14 different PLA studies on the topic that have been published in the last several years. The three most frequently discussed operations are those that have a domestic purpose or function. The first is domestic disaster relief and rescue, and here, of course, earthquakes and floods loom large. The second would fall under a broad rubric of stability maintenance operations, Weilan Xingdong in Chinese, and this refers to all sorts of civil and ethnic forms of unrest. And finally, counterterrorism, which refers to events that would occur primarily within China's ethnic minority frontiers. So yes, on the one hand, the PLA is looking more broad than it has in the past, but on the other hand, it's actually reaffirming its interest in internal security that it has always been tasked with as a people's liberation army. The last sort of emerging conventional wisdom that I wanted to challenge just a bit, and then I'll wrap up because I think I'm getting close to the end of time here, is that the development of an anti-ship ballistic missile will be a game changer. It might be, and one has to see how the system will develop. Nevertheless, I wanted to make three quick points. It's not a simple system. It's a very complex system. It's unclear if it will actually work. If all the parts will come together. Again, it might not, and that's something that we want to track and watch quite closely. The second point is that the complexity of the so-called kill chain, or all the different points in the system that have to work, actually create a set of vulnerabilities that can be exploited in order to defeat the system. And there are other countermeasures that are being developed based on the SM-3 missile system and directed energy weapons. I think we might be able to do more here, but it's certainly not it's not a system that doesn't have its weaknesses, and that's indeed one of the logics of strategies, that any strategy or tactic you adopt always has an associated vulnerability that can be exploited. The Chinese are trying to sort of exploit our carrier systems, and I think we in turn may have things to exploit themselves. The last point, though, is that it's really the demonstration of the capability more than its use that might be what Beijing is after. And here I'm sort of referring to recent writings from the early 2000s on this notion of strategic deterrence, or Zhanlie Weishi. And that has to do with really just demonstrating certain things that China might be able to do in the future, and that's going to really have the effect that Beijing wants. Because in peacetime, or even in a moderate crisis time, unless Beijing's goal is just to start a war with the United States. If it doesn't have that goal, if it's trying just to manage a crisis, shooting off an anti-ship ballistic missile is the surest way to escalate the crisis to a war. So it's more the deterrent threat, I think, that is most important with this system, and how it might shape our strategic thinking, not necessarily how it might compel states to change their behavior. So I've gone on too long. Thanks very much again for allowing me to participate in this panel and this program. My plug for MIT. So the MIT Security Studies program is a terrific place if you're interested not only in security studies but also in Asia. We've got 3 generalists on the faculty who can tell you all about military operations, how they work, strategy, and so forth. But we also have 3 faculty members, myself who works on China, Dick Samuels, who's a part of this effort who works on Japan, and we've just made an offer to Vipin Narang, who's going to be joining us in the fall, and he works on South Asia. So for those of you out there who have undergraduates or master's students who'd like to pursue a PhD, who'd like to do what Dan suggests, which is to get training both in the region and in security studies, please encourage them to apply to MIT. We're very excited about what we've put together here, and we just want to get the best students through the door. Thank you.
Then they can come work at AEI afterwards.
And Tom, I guess this entitles you to put in a plug for Stanford as well.
I tried to do that last night with the Scalapino Prize, but thank you for that opportunity.